The author, Kenneth Briggs, wrote his book, The Power of Forgiveness, after a mass shooting. And this is a paragraph from that book. The shooting in an Amish community. He says, the Amish made it look simple. 10 of their little precious girls had been shot by a man who had stormed into their peaceful school in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, on an October day in 2006. 5 had died, 5 lay wounded. As television crews rushed to the scene with their disaster faces and high noon voices, the stricken Amish gathered quietly. By spirit and habit, they were not conditioned to respond with outraged cries against the heavens or attacks on the evils of society, as others had done before the cameras in other scenes of tragedy and loss that the media had monitored. The Amish enfolded their grief within their normal circle of prayer and daily communion. They didn't speak out, they looked within. They did it together. Then they took a step that astonished many onlookers. They went to the home of the man who had killed and wounded their children to speak words of forgiveness to the man's family. They did it apparently with a political debate or a long process of getting ready. They just up and went. Because that's what you do to keep your end of the bargain with God and your fellow humans. End quote. Forgiveness. Surely one of the most difficult of human topics. And I want to be clear, the kind of forgiveness that Amish community showed in that instance is extraordinary. And we shouldn't expect that of ourselves every time. Some of us have experienced deep, deep hurts which we simply aren't ready, aren't able to forgive. No one should talk us out of that decision against our wills. No therapist, no family member, no preacher. Forgiveness is about releasing feelings of resentment and vengeance toward the other person. I think it requires action, like writing a letter. Not just thinking about forgiveness, but actually taking steps toward it, and that has to happen in its own time. There's an old Taoist story that I included in my monthly newsletter column this month. I'm sure you all have already read it, but just in case, the story is entitled The Sack of Potatoes. I think sometimes with a really complicated topic like forgiveness, we're better to tell stories about it than to go right at it with a discussion of principles about how to do it. Stories get into it in different angles than propositions do. So this version of this old story is adapted from a website called pranaworld.net. One day, a student approached the master for some wisdom about forgiveness. So the master gave her disciple an empty sack and a basket of potatoes and asked the disciple to write the name of people with whom he still feels angry, one name on each potato. The master said, think of all the people who have done or said something against you in the recent past, especially those you can't forgive. Put the name on a potato, put the potato in the sack. The disciple came up with a bunch of names, and soon after his sack was heavy with potatoes. So the master said, carry the sack with you wherever you go for 7 days, and then we'll meet again. Now, at first, the disciple didn't think much of it. Carrying the sack wasn't particularly difficult. But after some time, it became more of a burden. It got in his way, and it seemed to require more effort to carry it as time went on, even though it didn't weigh anymore. And after a few days, the sack began to stink. Those carved potatoes were giving off an odor. So they weren't just inconvenient to carry around, they were becoming really unpleasant. And the student wouldn't go certain places because he had a sack of stinky potatoes. Well, finally the week was over and the disciple went back to the sage, and the sage asked, do you have any thoughts about all this? And the disciple said, yes. When we're unable to forgive other people, we carry negative feelings with us everywhere, a lot like these potatoes. And that negativity becomes a burden to us, and after a while it festers. And the Master said that's exactly what happens when a person holds a grudge. So how can we lighten the load? We must strive to forgive. Well, forgiving is the equivalent of removing the corresponding potato from the sack. So how many of your transgressors have you been able to forgive? The disciple said, I've thought about it quite a bit. It required a lot of effort, but I've decided to forgive all of them. The Master said, very well, we can remove all the potatoes. Were there any people who transgressed against you this past week while you were carrying that sack of potatoes? The disciple thought for a while and realized, yeah, there were people. And then he panicked because he knew that sack that he just emptied was about to get filled up again. And he said, Master, if we continue like this, won't there always be potatoes in the sack week after week? And she said, yeah. As long as people speak or act against you in some way, you'll always have potatoes. The student said, but Master, we can't control what others do. So what good is the Dao in this case? We're not at the realm of the Dao yet, she said. Everything we've talked about so far is the conventional approach to forgiveness. It's the same thing that a lot of philosophers and most religions preach. We have to constantly strive to forgive. It's an important virtue. This is not the Tao, she said, because there is no striving in the Tao. And the student said, then what is the Tao? You can figure it out. She said, if the potatoes are unpleasant feelings, then what's the sack? He said, the sack is the case that allows me to hold on to the negativity. It's something within us that makes us dwell on being offended. He says, oh, it's my inflated sense of self-importance. And she says, what will happen if you let go of it? Then the things that people say or do against me no longer seem like such a major issue. And she said, in that case, you won't have any names to write on the potatoes. That means no more weight to carry around, no more bad smells. The Dao of Forgiveness is the conscious decision not just to remove some potatoes, but to relinquish the entire sack, end quote. Well, I like that story, and I hate it, because I'm not there yet. And no doubt, all these ancient stories need to be understood in context. You decide whether it fits you particularly. But there are a couple truths here that I think are pretty close to universal. First, most of us have to carry around the sack of potatoes for a while before we can get to forgiveness. It just doesn't happen on day one or week one or sometimes year one. This is no good, by the way. This is not good news for the self-help industry, who would love to sell you a book listing 10 easy steps to forgiveness in a month or less. But there are some things you can't rush, and I think forgiveness is one of them. Taoism has this built-in patience that I believe is curative for us Westerners. The ancient masters talk about sitting in muddy water and waiting for the mud to settle and the water to become clear as an allegory for being still in life until right action arises. Acting out of principle, they talk about, not out of the emotion of the moment. So they might say, carry around the burden for as long as you need to. But when it gets tiresome, there's another way. Second, as is the case in both the Amish and the Taoist stories, the action is ultimately taken, at least in large part, to benefit the person who's offering the forgiveness. We often, I think of forgiveness as benefiting the person we're forgiving, and that's probably true, at least in part. But just as much, and maybe more, it benefits the person who needs to do the forgiving. I hear folks now and then say that some person who has wronged them doesn't deserve forgiveness. I guess I have a couple thoughts about that. Sometimes the unwillingness to forgive hurts us more than it hurts the other person. And second, I wonder if you got to know the person, assuming it's safe to get to know the person, If you got to know the person, might you find that you didn't understand their motivation in quite the way you thought you did? Not in every case, but sometimes I think that's probably true. Friends, when we are ready for it, forgiveness is one of the most powerful forces in the human experience. Take one more story. Tony Felix. He was in the news last year, but a long time ago, he was 14 years old when he did what he did. Soon after he was born, his father abandoned his family. Several years later, his mother left him with his grandfather. He struggled to form attachments until, as a very young adolescent, he saw his cousin shot to death on the street. And in 8th grade, he became a member of a street gang that operated in his neighborhood. There he formed attachment. On the day in 1995, Tony and some of his friends had been playing video games. Most of the day, they were hungry, and they decided to call for a pizza. But they didn't have any money. So they decided that they would sit outside and wait for the pizza delivery person, and when the car pulled up, they'd point a gun at the driver and steal the pizza. They waited, and when the driver, Tariq Kamisa, a San Diego State University student, pulled up, Tony pointed the gun at him and said, "Give me the pizza." The driver resisted, and the leader of the gang said, "Tony, shoot him." Tony killed him with one shot. The driver was the son of Azim Kamisa, who's a Sufi Muslim. Now, Azim went through the prescribed 40 days of mourning, but he couldn't shake the terrible anger over his loss. It was destroying him. So a religious leader told him, "Take action." So he reached out to Tony's grandfather, Plez Felix. He befriended him. Eventually, the two began going to schools together, talking to children about the power of forgiveness to overcome hate and pain. And the grandfather of the young man who killed Kamisa's son says of Kamisa, quote, "Azim and I are brothers. He's my best friend. There's nothing I wouldn't do for Azim Kamisa. There's nothing that he wouldn't do for me." Tony, who murdered Tariq, says of Azim's forgiveness, quote, "I had a man forgive me for taking the life of his son. The least I can do is forgive people who harm me," end quote. So much more powerful than a book or a sermon is the lived example of what it means to forgive. And it goes even further. Azim Kamisa started a nonprofit named for his son with the aim of stopping gang violence. And from prison, Tony, who murdered Azim's son, wrote a blog about the shame of his actions and how other kids can avoid his fate. And it was published on Azim Kamisa's website. 8 years old now. And after having been in prison for 24 years, he was granted parole and released almost a year ago. Azim was there to testify on his behalf and gave him a job at the foundation after his release. And the foundation has reached over 500,000 students in San Diego with presentations by Azim and Tony's grandfather. Forgiveness can change the heart of a person and thereby can change the life of a person. And a changed life shines light on the people around us. And the influence of that kind of life can begin to grow. There are very few stories as dramatic as the one I just told you. But we've all been wronged one way or another. Maybe today. And we all have the power, when the time is right for us, to drop the whole sack of potatoes and do something different. It's hard. It takes focus and intention. But we can forgive. Maybe the person who wronged us was misunderstood, or maybe they really don't deserve forgiveness. But maybe you deserve to shed that burden. If that's the case, there is a different way. May we each find it in our time. Amen.